I was lucky enough to marry Ree Smith, working together on our family ranch west of Pawhuska. I don't think she ever wants to see another feed bill for the rest of her life.
I'm going to take them ranch-style chicken sandwiches, one of my husband's favorite sandwiches. They're grilled chicken breast top.
For over 2 decades, Ree Drummond has welcomed the world into her kitchen, her ranch, and her life. She built something rare in the world of media, genuine trust. Millions of people felt like they knew her, not just as a television personality or a cookbook author, but as a neighbor, a friend, a woman who made you feel like you could sit down at her table and belong there. So when that warmth started to flicker, when the posts became quieter and the energy on screen felt different, her audience noticed. And now, the full picture is coming into view, one that explains everything about the changes happening inside the Drummond family, and why Ladd, the quietly devoted cowboy who has always let his actions speak louder than his words, has been stepping away from a life he has known since before he could walk. This is not a story about endings. It is a story about what love looks like when life demands something different from you than it ever has before. Ladd Drummond is not a man who does things halfway. Born into a ranching family in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, he inherited not just land but a philosophy: that the land comes first, that the work never stops, and that a man's value is measured by his presence and his effort. The Drummond Land and Cattle Company is one of the largest ranching operations in the United States, spanning hundreds of thousands of acres across the Oklahoma plains. Managing that kind of operation is not a job you clock in and out of. It is a way of life that swallows your mornings before sunrise and holds on long after dark. Ladd has lived that life faithfully, the way his father did, and his grandfather before that. So when the people who work alongside him every day started noticing changes, they paid attention. Ranch hands who had spent years watching Ladd operate with clockwork discipline began to see something shift. Responsibilities he had always kept close to himself, overseeing cattle sales, managing early morning rounds, making the big calls on equipment and land, were gradually handed off to others. His brothers Tim and Todd began carrying weight they had not previously been asked to carry. Trusted longtime employees found themselves stepping into roles that had, for as long as anyone could remember, belonged to Ladd alone. The ranch was not falling apart. If anything, it was adapting. But the man at the center of it all was quietly redirecting his energy, and those who knew him well understood that he would never do that without a serious reason. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand who Ree Drummond is and what she built. When she started her blog, The Pioneer Woman, back in 2006, she was simply a woman who had traded city life for a cattle ranch in rural Oklahoma, fell in love with a cowboy, and wanted to write about it. She had no roadmap, no media training, no team of strategists. She had stories, recipes, and an authentic voice that connected with people almost immediately. The blog became a phenomenon. The Food Network show followed. Then the cookbooks, each one a bestseller. Then the Mercantile, a restaurant and retail store in downtown Pawhuska that transformed a quiet Oklahoma town into a genuine tourist destination. By the early 2020s, Ree Drummond had built an empire worth an estimated $75 million, and she had done it entirely on the strength of her personality and her willingness to share her life openly. That openness was the foundation of everything. Fans knew what she cooked for Sunday dinner. They knew when one of the kids was struggling in school or when Ladd had done something that drove her crazy in the most lovable way. They knew the funny moments and the hard ones. The audience did not just follow her, they cared about her. They felt invested in her story the way you feel invested in someone you have known for years. Which is precisely why, when that story started becoming harder to read, so many people felt the change in their bones before they could name it. The posts got quieter. The candid behind-the-scenes moments became less frequent. The long, rambling blog entries that felt like sitting down with a friend over coffee started arriving less often, and when they did, they felt more carefully considered, less spontaneous. On screen, Ree was still warm and still charming, but there was something behind her eyes that cameras, no matter how good, cannot fully conceal. Filming schedules were adjusted. Appearances at the Mercantile became less predictable. Guest spots on other shows and promotional commitments were quietly declined. Her team cited scheduling, and that was true enough, but it was not the whole truth. Before the diagnosis that would eventually explain everything, the Drummond family had already been through a moment that shook them deeply. In March of 2021, Ladd and his nephew Caleb were working to fight a fire that had broken out on the ranch when their fire trucks collided in the chaos. The accident was serious. Caleb was airlifted to a hospital in critical condition. Ladd, in true fashion, initially refused the ambulance and attempted to drive himself to get checked out. Doctors discovered that he had broken his neck in 2 places. By any measure, he was extraordinarily fortunate to walk away from that accident at all. Ladd went through surgery, spent time in a neck brace, and was ordered to rest, a prescription that goes against every instinct a man like him has ever had. He recovered, went back to work, and the family moved forward the way they always do, with quiet determination and without much public drama. But the people closest to Ree noticed that something had changed in her after that accident. Not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in the small and private ways that matter most. The fear of nearly losing her husband settled somewhere deep inside her. She began to understand, in a visceral way that you can only understand through experience, how quickly everything can change. How one ordinary Tuesday on a ranch you have lived on your whole life can become the day that alters everything. That awareness, that fragility newly felt and never quite forgotten, became important context for what came next. In early 2024, Ree went in for what was described as a routine checkup. She had been managing fatigue, persistent headaches, and a general sense of not feeling like herself for some time. Given the pace she maintained, a television show, a restaurant, social media, cookbook projects, a family, a working ranch, it was easy to chalk those symptoms up to exhaustion. Anyone living her life might have felt the same. She pushed through, the way she had always pushed through, because that is what she does. That is what both of the Drummonds do. But the tests came back with findings that could not be attributed to a busy schedule. The specifics of her condition are something Ree has kept private, and that privacy deserves to be respected completely. What she has shared is enough to understand the gravity of the situation. What was discovered required immediate attention. It was not something that could be resolved with a single procedure or a short course of treatment. It was a long-term health challenge, the kind that changes the architecture of your daily life and demands that you rethink the assumptions you have built everything around. For a woman whose entire public identity was built on doing it all, cooking, filming, writing, managing, mothering, ranching, smiling, showing up, receiving a diagnosis that fundamentally limited what she could sustain was not just a medical event. It was an identity confrontation. The things she had always used to define herself, her energy, her reliability, her endless capacity to show up for everyone and everything at once, were suddenly things she could no longer take for granted. Treatment brought with it a new and demanding structure. Medications to manage carefully, side effects to navigate and adjust around, dietary changes that required rethinking the food-centered life she had always loved, medical appointments that could not be moved or missed, many of them in cities far from the Pawhuska Ranch, requiring travel that pulled her away from home and routine. Stress, doctors told her, would make everything worse. The irony of that prescription was not lost on anyone who knew her story. Stress reduction for a woman who had built her career on managing a dozen things simultaneously, who had turned controlled chaos into an art form, was not a simple ask. It required dismantling habits and expectations that had been built over 2 decades. Ladd sat with her through every appointment. He learned the medical language he had never needed before. He asked the questions that needed asking and remembered the answers. He listened in waiting rooms while doctors explained things that were sometimes frightening and always complex. And he processed it all with the same steady, quiet focus he brings to every difficult situation the ranch has ever handed him. For a man more comfortable reading the signs of a changing sky than reading a medical chart, this was new territory. But he moved through it with deliberate care, because that is what Ree needed. And meeting the needs of the people he loves is something Ladd understands instinctively even when he cannot articulate it out loud. What Ladd then did was remarkable precisely because of how quietly he did it. There was no announcement, No dramatic declaration posted to social media. No interview explaining his decision. He simply began making different choices. He started coming in from the ranch earlier. He made sure he was present for Ree's harder days, the days when getting through the morning routine required more energy than she expected to spend. He began accompanying her to medical appointments not just occasionally, but consistently, treating it the way he treats every other important responsibility, as something that requires his presence and his full attention. At the same time, he started letting go of the things he had always held tightly. The cattle sales he had personally overseen for decades began to be handled by his brothers. The morning decisions that had always been his alone became collaborative. Ranch hands who had looked to him for every significant call found themselves with more authority and more trust. The operation did not suffer for it. His brothers proved capable and the ranch continued to thrive, which made it easier for Ladd to release his grip without guilt. He had built something durable enough to run without him being at the center of every single moment. That realization, both humbling and freeing, gave him the space to be where he was most needed. For a fourth-generation rancher whose identity has always been inseparable from his land and his labor, this kind of stepping back does not come naturally. His father and grandfather worked that land until their bodies gave out. That was the model he had grown up measuring himself against. Choosing to step back while still capable felt, at first, like some kind of failure, like abandoning a duty that had been passed to him through generations of sacrifice and devotion. It took time, and probably more than a few long, solitary drives across the Oklahoma plains, to arrive at a different understanding. Being present for his wife was not a retreat from duty. It was duty in a different form, one that required just as much of him, maybe more. The Drummond children responded to their mother's diagnosis the way Ree and Ladd had raised them to respond to hard things, with quiet strength, practical action, and an absence of self-pity. Alex, the eldest, began making more frequent trips home, not for filming or special events, but simply to be there. She helped with the small things that add up to enormous things when someone is conserving energy, organizing, prepping, being present in a kitchen that has always been the emotional center of the Drummond household. Paige took on more administrative responsibility for the family's businesses, managing elements that her mother no longer had the bandwidth to oversee without cost to her health. Bryce stepped into ranch responsibilities that freed his father's schedule. And Todd, who joined the Drummond family as a foster son and became permanent proof that family is built as much through love and choice as through blood, showed up the way family does during hard seasons, without being asked and without making it about himself. None of them made a public display of any of this. The Drummonds have always been selective about what they share, even with an audience that feels like extended family. The highlight reel has always been generously shared. The genuinely hard things have always stayed inside the walls of that ranch house. This situation has followed that same pattern, and there is something deeply respectful about that, both toward Ree's privacy and toward the seriousness of what the family has been navigating. The business decisions that followed the diagnosis were significant and, in retrospect, completely logical. The mercantile continued to operate and to draw visitors from across the country, but its daily rhythms were no longer dependent on Ree's personal presence. A strong management team handled operations with the kind of confidence that comes from years of working alongside a demanding and detail-oriented owner. Ree appeared when she felt well enough, connected with fans when she had energy to give, and trusted the people she had chosen to run things in her absence. The store did not decline. Visitors still came to Pawhuska. The experience they were looking for was preserved without requiring Ree to be physically present for every moment of it. The Food Network show required careful negotiation, not with the network, but with the physical reality of production. Filming a season requires sustained energy, multiple takes, hours on camera, and the kind of stamina that does not adjust easily for a body dealing with a chronic health condition. Production teams shortened filming days, planned more rest into the schedule, and worked with Ree's good days rather than against her difficult ones. The episodes that came out of this adjusted process were not lesser for it. If anything, working within new limits seemed to sharpen the focus of what made her show worth watching in the first place, The warmth, the food, the sense of a real home and a real life being shared without pretense. Cookbook timelines were renegotiated with understanding that the value of a Reed Drummond cookbook is not in its publication date, but in the voice and the care she brings to every page. Publishers adjusted. Deadlines became guides rather than ultimatums. The lesson embedded in all of these adjustments was one that applies far beyond the Drummond story, that the most sustainable kind of success is the kind that accounts for the humanity of the person at its center.